when life is wild. And we've talked about several ways in which that could happen to us this morning. This morning I want to talk to you about a subject that sometimes is not addressed very well or has not been in the life of the church, but the Bible is not silent on it. I remember in my second pastorate some years ago, I came to a point in that period of my life. I was about 29 or 30 years of age. Our three children were there, and it was a time in my life in which we had just lost our fourth child, a son, Joel, who had lived 8 hours, and we were going through that. It was a time in which Lisa and I were struggling in our marriage. We didn't know which way that was going. You say preachers struggle with their marriages? Yeah. We were going through that, trying to figure out of all that trauma and the fact of losing a child, and sometimes that is one of the number one causes for divorce, that couples can never get back together and understand each other after a tragedy like that in their lives. So we were struggling through all of that. We were in a small isolated town in which they couldn't keep a therapist or counselor in the town. And it was a time in my life in which the particular assignment that I had thrust me into a community-wide exposure, and having had some background in pastoral counseling, I had become kind of the pastor and the town counselor in that sense of meeting a lot of needs with the hospital and various places in that area at that particular time. But there was very little sympathy for mental health issues, and there was very little sympathy for especially leaders and preachers and pastors to have those kinds of needs in their lives. In fact, it could be the death of your career at that particular moment in those times. And I was living in an era of time in which there was some unwritten rules in the life of the church, and one of them was that pastors should not have close friends among the members of the church. And so I had very few friends, nobody to turn to. I was isolated and alone, couldn't talk to Lisa about it, couldn't talk to anybody about it, was afraid to even mention it for fear that it would jeopardize, couldn't go to my superior, not sure I could trust anybody with what was going on in my life. So finally, out of a desperation at that particular time, they did have an 800 ministry number that you could call, that pastors could call for help in times of a great need like this. And so I called the 800 number and shared with them a little bit about what I was going through and what I was experiencing, and followed that up with a call to my uncle who was a trained psychotherapist out in Ohio, and talked with him a while, and who had pastored as well, so he understood the strains of that process on both sides of that. And they both said to me, when I called the 800 number and called my psychotherapist uncle, they both said to me, Leray, if you were in our locale at this particular time, what you're describing to us, I would have you admitted to the hospital for evaluation and possible medication for at least depression, if not something else. Well, there was nowhere to go at that point in time. There was no hospital in any distance. There was no place to go at that point. I remember getting off of the phone and getting down on my knees at my desk chair and saying, Lord, you know where I'm at. And you know the vulnerability, and you know the risks. And I cannot fix myself, and I don't know where to turn or what to do. Unless you help me, I'm done here. We're through. And I'll write my letter of resignation. And I remember the Lord came to me at that very moment in time, and the first thing He began to do is bust up the rule that you can't have close friends in the life of the church. I mean, He busted that deal. He said, you need to go, and He named a name who, interestingly enough, as I was preparing this week, that friend is still a friend today and a brother, and he called me this week. I hadn't heard from him in a while, but while I'm preparing this very message, he called me, and I thought, wow, that's kind of cool, and wanted to get together. He still has interest in my life. He was the kind of guy that I could go out into the woods. We did some hunting together, and it came to a place that we developed over time a relationship in which I could tell him literally everything. We talked about everything. I mean, not the stuff not so pretty, the things that preachers shouldn't have to struggle with, or so we think. And I could share anything with him and know that it was safe. Very few people in my life have been those kinds of friends in my life, but I needed it. And at that moment in time, at that period of time, I longed for a new job. I remember getting the want ads and start looking through the want ads, deciding what different career I could choose. I was done with pastoral ministry. I didn't think I could go on with that. And I remember looking for a new assignment. And if I could just somehow, I thought, get back to some better days in which life was better. I felt in exile. And according to a recent study by the World Health Organization and Harvard Medical School, this is not an isolated case, and it's not something isolated in our world. They tell us that America right now is probably, in some of the testing they've done across the world, one of the saddest nations in the world. Isn't that interesting? We would dub America as one of the saddest nations in spite of our prosperity and our wealth. According to the World Health Organization, depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. 16% of Americans will have an episode of major depression at some time in their lives, and 6% of all the Americans, 14 million in number, have suffered from major depression in the past year. Think about that. And one of the things that's alarming to me, and even in the seminars and some of the places I've been in recent months, one of the things that keeps coming up that Department of Health and Human Services confirms is that there are 3 million adolescents reported at least one major depressive episode in the past year, and more than 2 million reported severe depression that impeded their daily functioning ability. And they've discovered out of this study that there's a share of 12 to 20-year-olds who have suffered major depression in the last year that has increased by 37% since 2005, between 2005 and 2014. So that the psychiatrist and Professor Erin Gayatri adds a sobering conclusion as she looked at all the statistics, and she said we are witnessing a rising plague of melancholy in America, and especially among the youth and the young people. Now, when you begin to talk about depression, it comes from a wide spectrum, from feelings of sad, and all of us have experienced some kind of environmental depression in terms of the cycles of life, and sad things happen, and there's daily events that happen to all of us, to the more serious diagnosis of clinical depression and bipolar disease as well. And the interesting thing, and I've heard this recently again as I've sat in some of these mental health seminars and symposiums and the things that they hold to deal with the epidemic that's growing in our country and literally around the world, when the question is always invariably asked, well, what causes that depression? And invariably the answer is from the professionals, we don't know. They'll cite genetics. It's in the family tree. It's in the genetics of the family. Some are now beginning to cite what they call ACE, adverse child experiences. They'll talk about some have the malfunction of the brain because of brain injuries, and there's all the gamut of the reasons that they will give to that. But oftentimes, they don't know where to trace it. Likely some of you have struggled with some kind of depression in your own life. Maybe it's required treatment. Maybe you've experienced the stigma of it. You bear the pain of it all privately because you don't even feel comfortable sharing it in the life of the church. And so you suffer alone. One of the things that we have come to deal with some in life skills is the adverse child experiences, in which Dr. Paul Hegstrom has talked about the way in which the brain works, in which when there's trauma in their lives, the emotional centers, the limbic system, the traffic flowing to the cognitive centers is very little. It's mostly emotions that are driving everything that we do in our behavior. And the more neuronal traffic that moves forward in the brain, it shuts down the frontal lobes of the ability to think. So we lose the impulse control and we live in this depression of our lives. And we've discovered that there are things that happen in the life for the child that lacks the fullness of three chemicals in the brain, dopamine, serotonin, and epinephrine, that it causes the child to take the traumas in its life and come to experience it as being responsible for 100% of everything that's ever happened to it in its life. And it's not so much what happens to the child, it's what the child, without the chemicals and without somebody in their life talking to them about what's going on in their life, it's what they come to believe about what's happened to them. And it begins to feed into the self-talk that becomes negative and stacks and stacks and stacks, so that even as we read in the opening worship today, as Jeremiah went through depression in his life and writes the book of Lamentations, he talks a lot about what he's telling himself about God and about his experience in his life. And much of our self-talk becomes negative, coming out of the wounds of childhood, and sometimes it's even subconscious, and we don't even know what we're saying to ourselves. We're not even aware of what's going on in our lives, and Satan loves it because he takes the woundedness of a child and the weakness and the vulnerability of a child, and then he brings the self-talk, and Satan doesn't come and say, you are dirty, damaged, indifferent, you're no good. He doesn't say that. What he does, he comes and perches on our shoulder and works into the very psychic of a child and gets him to begin to say to himself, I am dirty, damaged, indifferent. I am hopeless. I am no good. I am not worthy of love. He doesn't ever do it in the third person. He does it in the first person, so that he gets us agreeing with him about what he's suggesting to us out of our woundedness. And it eventually drives fear, and it drives anger, which doesn't become resolved, and then eventually the depression, the frozen anger. So the important question is if somehow, using the scripture here, the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but mighty for casting down the strongholds, the way we think, casting down imaginations, what we tell ourselves, what we think about things, and every high thing that's exalted against the true knowledge of God, and we bring every thought into captive obedience to Jesus Christ. And when we can back the adrenaline down and allow the chemicals that God's put in the brain for the adult to fully function, then the traffic changes, and we begin to think through our emotions instead of our emotions driving all of our thinking and our behavior. And we begin to experience that. But how do you get there? We need a song. We need some preparation for that. We need some teaching. We need some training. And the Bible's not silent on this. And in fact, it's not silent on depression. Many of God's great chosen leaders suffered from depression in varying degrees in the Bible. Moses, as we've looked at in the last few weeks, suffered depression. Elijah suffered depression, spent days in a cave thinking that he was all alone and wouldn't even eat. David suffered depression. Read the Psalms over and over again. Paul suffered depression. He writes to the Corinthians, it got to the place that I was in despair of even my life, and I didn't even want to go on living because of what was happening to me at a particular time in his life. Jesus suffered depression. My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. And so great was his depression that it had physiological results of bleeding blood out of the very sweat pores of his body, out of a broken heart. Great saints like Charles Spurgeon, the great London preacher, suffered depression. They tell us that even his wife came to a point in his life where she had to literally write Bible verses on the ceiling of their bedroom above his bed so he could begin to quote scripture and come out of his depression enough to be able to get up and go preach to the thousands in the great church in London. Abraham Lincoln, the great leader he was, suffered incredible depression in his life. And so as we've been working through this series, When Life is Wild, we've looked at the Israelites. You can imagine that coming out of the oppression of 430 years of slavery, that they would have understood something about depression in their lives, the struggles. It's not a stretch to see that there would be generations upon generations upon generations of trauma that they didn't know how to deal with. And it's partly why God could not take them the shortcut route. He had to take them the long way around because they were children in their thinking, and emotionally they were arrested in their ability to deal with with the normal things in their lives, and it played a part in their lives. And when you look at the whole biblical record, the children of Israel suffered in varying degrees throughout their history. They were individually and corporately found in exile of all kinds. And we come to this, we could look at a dozen different passages in Scripture this morning as we talk about this subject. But I want us to focus on one of the Psalms, Psalm 121. It's a beloved psalm. It's one of 15 that are clustered around together in the Psalms that somewhere the label was put on them, Songs of Ascent. And the reason it came that, because the Israelites often used the Song of Ascents out of the Psalms in Jesus' day on the long journey to Jerusalem, up to Jerusalem, the mountain hill of Jerusalem, the city, for the great religious festivals. There would be long journeys coming from their homes, and they would sing these 15 songs of ascents as they were climbing on the long journey up the road to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival. They were kind of like the iPod playlist for the journey of the Israelites. And this psalm became a song, a prayer that the people would recite and sing. Now, the author, we're not real clear about. Was it David? A lot of the Psalms were written by David. Well, was it one of the priests who wrote this after the Babylonian exile, some hundreds of years later? We're not sure because of the collection that it is. But what we do know, perhaps God didn't allow the author to be fully identified because he wanted these psalms, and especially this psalm, to function in all times of depression and exile and oppression. He wanted it to function for his people, that they could use this and it wouldn't just be tied. And if you could imagine who might have wrote it. If it was David, you could think about David's life. And if it was the priest in exile, you could think about that this song came out of exile. It came out of difficult, sad times and deep depression in their lives. Think about David, for instance, anointed king by the prophet Samuel. But it's years before he actually gets to realize the position, because King Saul was in the position. But you remember David when he was anointed king. He came from a family in which his daddy didn't think much of him, and he sent him out to do the dirty work of being the shepherd boy. And when the time came for Samuel to anoint, the prophet to anoint who was going to be the next king, they called in all the 8 brothers, but they didn't call in David. And when Samuel asked about David, his daddy made some disparaging comments about, he's not worth much. He's just a runt. Don't worry about it. David grew up rejected in his own family. David grew up, he was acquainted with these difficulties in his life. And then he finally makes it to the palace as the musician who plays the harp in the midst of a mad king who's getting madder every day and going into deep depression because of his disobedience to God and the spiritual things in his life and the neglect of spiritual things in his life. And he's going into deep depression, and he begins to become increasingly jealous of David, who is growing in his popularity and growing in his ability with the military, to the point that he's threatening Saul's very position. And Saul is not beyond, not once, not twice, but several times throwing a spear at David to pin him against the wall while he was playing the music to hopefully calm the melancholy of King Saul. And David ends up having to run to the mountains because Saul is out to kill him. And he ends up in places, this is one of the caves in Israel where David would have hid from King Saul, up in the mountains, finding the cave where he would hide. And it's likely that in one of these caves, if David is indeed the author, that he would have looked out of the mouth of this cave at all the mountains around him, and he would have written the 121st Psalm in great distress and fear and depression. Let's look at that psalm. I lift up my eyes to the mountain. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forevermore. Now, not only was this out of David's life, but it was a psalm that was likely sung and recited when the people were in exile in Babylon. They would have sung it not as something that they knew, experienced, but they would have sung it as a hope for the future. Hope to get back to the mountains of Jerusalem. Hope to get back to the mountain of where the temple of God was, on the mountain. Because Jerusalem was always on a hill. You always went up to Jerusalem. The Bible would always say, we're going up to Jerusalem, because that's where the city was, and that was where the temple where God dwelt. So when you wanted to be in the very presence of God, you went up to the mountain and up to the temple and into the temple, and there you experienced the presence of God. But the exiles, now in captivity, they cannot go up to the mountain. They cannot go up to the temple. They cannot go up and go in to find the presence of God. They are, as the psalmist said in Psalm 137, they were by the rivers of Babylon, and we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. In fact, they said for a little while we hung up our harps because we couldn't even sing these psalms. We were so depressed. But eventually, in the midst of the depression of exile that lasted 70 years, they began to sing these psalms again as songs of hope of what might come again, of the future of the mountains, with a distant memory. And so they would sing these words, I will lift up my eyes, the eyes of memory of what used to be, the eyes of hope of what we will have someday if we can ever get back to Jerusalem, to the mountains. But they had to begin to realize something. What do you do in the meantime? There is no temple. The mountain doesn't cut it. The mountain is not available. The presence of God in the physical temple is not available. So the question would rise, where does my help come from in the meantime? Where do I go now? What do I do? And so in a state of deep depression and sadness, whether in the mountains as a refugee, an asylum seeker from a mad king, or exile in a distant country, or whether they were taking a long journey later on in their history to the temple of God, a long, thirsty journey, these songs were sung in which they found comfort in the midst of sorrow, peace in the midst of anxiety, and hope in the midst of despair and depression in their lives. So what does the prayer mean? What's the song mean? What does the writer mean? I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. I don't know about you, but I was born in the Rocky Mountains, Colorado Springs. Just a little drive up into the mountains. Went there many times. My grandparents was raised as a child on summer vacations in the Rocky Mountains. Beautiful. I still love to go to the mountains. The majestic, drive through the narrow roads of the mountains and look at the majestic peaks, especially as the sun begins to set and they begin to have a shadow and a glow about them. It's gorgeous. Love it. But you realize that the mountains, yet though they bear life, they have life in them. They really are lifeless. The mountains are a bunch of show, but they don't do much. They can't really do much for you in your life. In fact, we talk about mountains not only as beautiful and majestic, but sometimes we talk about mountains as daunting. They become the obstacles of life. We talk about our obstacles in our life as the mountains and the need to move the mountains and the obstacles on a long journey. Think of the Think of the pioneers who are coming across in covered wagons and they come to the mountains. How are we going to get across this? I'm even thinking about that as Lisa and I are talking about going to Idaho for Thanksgiving to be with her parents. And we're talking about this. We love to drive. I would love to drive, but when you get into late November, December, there are some daunting passes in Wyoming and in Idaho that may be full of snow by the time you climb up out of the valleys. And it's always a dicey thing whether you're going to get through. And we've been in some motels overnight because of a blizzard in the middle of something. And so the mountains become a daunting, risky thing in our lives. And it was awareness of the psalmist that the mountains, as beautiful as they are, become daunting as well. And they provide absolutely no answer in the midst of depression. To the exiles longing for the mountain, there's no help from the mountain. The awareness that for what we've depended upon is no longer available. And we have to find something else to sustain us in our depression. So the psalmist answers his own question. I've looked to the mountains. They're beautiful and majestic, and I enjoy in the mountains. I've looked to the mountains, but they're also the obstacles in my life. They are no help. They are lifeless. And who then is my help? Where does it come from? It doesn't come from the mountains. My help comes from the Lord, the psalmist says, the maker of heaven. Notice the name Lord. In some of your Bibles, the Lord may be in all caps. That's important because this is the word in the Hebrew, Yahweh, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago when God came to Moses and said, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew me as El Shaddai, Almighty God who can do anything. I didn't reveal to them my real name, I am, or Yahweh. I gave them El Shaddai, but I'm going to give to you, Moses, my real name. My real name is I am, which means I will be who I will be, and I'm always present, and I am always there, but you can't box me in, you can't box me out, you can't push me around, you can't pull my leg, you can't control me. I will be who I will be, but I will be present in your life. And so the psalmist has come to know the Lord who is present in all of his life in this moment. And the psalmist has come to know the Lord who makes covenants and promises, who promises us to be a good father and a great husband. So that God would say to his people over and over again in the Old Testament, they will be my people and I will be their God or their husband or their father. Even more, he says, I'm the maker of heaven and earth, the creator, sustainer of the universe. He's not a mountain, and he's not created. The psalmist is recognizing what we need to be reminded of in our day, that this is the eternal one who is not created out of nature, but who bends nature himself. Who makes the day and the darkness and paths in the wilderness and can bring water from dry ground and bread out of the sky. This is the God the psalmist came to know. And so the Psalms met to be prayed and recited and sang until it became a part of a person's thinking in life, even in the dark, depressing times, and it became a part of their self-talk. I look to the mountains. Where does my help come from? Mountains not available anymore. Where will it come from? The Lord is my help. Would you say those first two verses with me from your notes there, from Psalm 121? Let's say it together out loud. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And then comes verse 3. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. And indeed he watches over Israel with neither slumber nor sleep. Psalmist speaks to the treacherous journey. You ever driven or hiked in the mountains? You know the place. We're on a trail. You're looking down over thousands of feet of precipice, and one slip of the foot and a few pebbles and gravel, and you could be over the precipice. I just talked to someone this week who told about a ski trip in the Rocky Mountains in which they were coming down with a van full of people, and they went into a skid, and bumped up against the guardrail on the other side was thousands of feet in drop-off. And the guardrail kept them from going over. The psalmist is talking about the one slip of the foot. And what's he talking about? He's talking about what happens when we get depressed. We begin to think that God is absent, that He is not present, that we're out of the grip of His hand in our lives, and that ultimately God is gone forever. He's abandoned you. We begin to think He's somehow mad at us because we haven't measured up, that we think He rejects us somewhere along the line, that He's forgotten about us, and that He's gone to sleep. And in fact, in David's day, in the Old Testament, there were many religions in which the gods would go to sleep. And bad things would happen when the gods went to sleep. But the psalmist says, this God doesn't go to sleep. He does not slumber. Now, when we read this psalm, if we've been hurt and wounded, we read it like children. And children take things very literal. No, you can't have that toy. They don't hear you can't have that toy. What they hear is, you will never, ever, ever, in a million zillion years, ever get that toy. It's hopeless to them. You didn't say that. You can't have that toy now. Now means forever to a child. Many times we read scripture like that. And so this is not a guarantee or a promise that you won't have any struggles. This is not a guarantee that you'll escape pain. It's not even a guarantee that you can avoid medication and treatment for what's happening in your life. It's not any of those things, but it is a promise that in the midst of all of the treacherous journey, on the narrow pathways where you think it's going to be over and it's one slip and God's going to abandon you forever, it is the promise that in the struggle, God will be present, alert, and engaged in your life. That's why we love the song that's been made famous. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. God has constant vigilance. Notice in this whole psalm that the term watches over, it appears 6 times or more. It's the main point of God's care. The word implies not simply watching. It's the difference of this. Some of you have children, you've gone to a playground, and sometimes you've done what I've done. When you go to the playground, you like to find the park bench, or if you're a grandfather, you like to do this more often. You like to find the park bench and say, go play. No, if you have a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old, that would be very dangerous. So when we watch over them, we're not sitting on the sideline watching while life happens to our 2 and 3-year-old. No. We say, I'm going to go with you and I'll help you down the big slide. I'll regulate the speed of the merry-go-round, if you can even find a merry-go-round in a park anymore. Too many lawsuits. We take our 2 and 3-year-olds and we engage in their lives. And when we watch over them, we're with them and we're helping them. This is the picture of the psalmist. It's not the God who sits and says, okay, have fun. You're on your own. It is the God who enters into the struggle. He who protects and guides and blesses and does not slumber. And just as He cares personally for you, He cares for His people. Let's read this verses together. Verse 3. You ready? Here we go. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Verse 5 and 6, the Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor moon by night. The psalmist is talking about the threats that come in the day and the night in our lives. The sun, when you're in the desert, like the mountains I showed on the screen, when you're out in the desert, even in those mountains, blistering heat in the parts of Israel where that's at. It leaves the travelers thirsty and sunburnt with no shade, no oasis, no place to hide. But for God's people, the psalmist is saying, for the God's people, the Lord becomes our shade at your right hand. The word shade is translated shadow. It's the presence of God who's not distant again, but the God who is so close that his shadow is cast over you. So that the psalmist wrote in Psalm 91, I will sing in the shadow of your wings. That's how close the Lord is. You remember, this is not a new imagery. We've studied in the last few weeks when Egypt came out of the oppression, or when Israel came out of the oppression of Egypt, God gave them a cloud by day and a pillar of light, cloud by night. He protected them in the day and the night as well. But there's more here to this moon. What about the moon? Well, the moon speaks of the extreme cold temperatures in the desert. If you've ever been out in the desert, as hot as it is in the daytime, it's very, very, very cold in the evening when the sun goes down. Out on the sand, it can become very, very cold. And the psalmist is speaking to the fact that there is protection from the extremes. But he also is referring here to the effects of the moon, the lunar effects of the moon. And that's real, isn't it? There's gravitational pull. Talk to any educator, talk to any health professional, talk to those in the Department of Corrections. They'll always talk about the full moon. And there is some truth to behavior that seems to happen because of that. In human behavior, because of the gravitational moon and where the lunar planets and how they all work together. And so the author has experienced that, though they didn't have the science that we would have to talk about it. But they talked about the lunar effects of the moon. And that's where we get the word lunar or lunatic. One who's struggling mentally because of the gravitational pull of the moon. And so the psalmist is talking about this creepiness that's akin to walking in a graveyard under a full moon. We understand that language. And the psalmist says that God, who is our help, will hold at bay the dangers of sinister lunacy in the middle of the night terrors, the sleepwalking, the insomnia, the fear, the anxiety, the bipolar experiences of nature, both in nature and in human behavior. The psalmist is trusting the Lord to keep him from the dangers of the bipolar extremes symbolized in the sun and the moon, the day and the night, the heat and the cold, the sanity and the insanity. So say it with me, verse 5. And 6, the Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. And then verse 6 and 7, the Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. What does that word harm mean? Is this a promise that somehow we'll escape tragedy and pain and issues in our life? No. The word used for harm here speaks to a final and a complete evil that destroys you. That's God's promise here. It's a reference to ultimate destructive evil, the danger of eternal. It's describing the destruction of the soul. And the scripture says that the Lord will keep you from all evil. Jesus put it this way when he taught us to pray the Lord's Prayer, keep us from the evil one. That's what he's talking about here. He's praying that the evil one will not be able to use and take advantage of your woundedness and your hurt and your sin and use it totally against you for destruction. So that in verse 8, the psalmist concludes, the Lord will watch over your coming and your going both now and forevermore. Coming and going. What in the world does that mean? Well, have you ever been on a long journey? Or you've been away from home and you're homesick? And you're longing for home, and you're longing for a better place, and you're longing to get there, and you're longing to get to your destination, and you don't think it will ever end? Mommy, are we there yet? Daddy, are we there yet? 30 minutes after you've left on a 6-hour trip. Are we there yet? No. We used to tell our kids, when we get to the third, we've done this trip so long, we could tell them, when you get to the third McDonald's, we'll be halfway there. They understood that. They're counting McDonald's. Are we there yet? You don't think you're ever going to make it. Depression's like that, isn't it? If you've ever been in depression, you don't think you're ever going to come back. Going and coming. Coming. Have you ever entered a season or experience in your life and you felt like you were walking into a trap that you were never going to get out of? The narrow little door, and you're trapped, and you'll never get out. You feel exiled, totally isolated. Both feelings are terrible, aren't they? Have you ever experienced them? Terrible feelings. Never going to end. Trapped and never getting out. Here's the promise. The Lord is watching over. He's engaged, guiding every step so that you will get through. You will get home. You will get out. You will make it. Not once, not twice, but now and forevermore. Because the Lord watches over you. No wonder Andre Crouch from another era wrote the song maybe some of you recognize, Through It All. Through it all, I've learned to trust in Jesus. I've learned to trust in God. Through it all, I've learned to depend upon His Word. That's the promise. You're in the palm of His hand. He's got this. I love it. We tend to say to each other, you've got this, you've got this. No, I don't got this. But God does. God's got this. You're in good hands, better than Allstate. He's got it. Now let me ask you this morning as we close. Have you ever stood looking into the future and wondering if you're ever going to get to a better place in your life? Maybe you've graduated or been laid off and you don't know where the next job is going to come from. There's no job in sight. The divorce that's ended more than a marriage in your life. You don't think it'll ever be better. The terrible decision you've been forced and pressured to make, a move away from all that you've known and loved. Maybe it's been the retirement to what? Maybe it's been the terrible diagnosis. You've known some dark nights, sleepless, restless, can't let go of the worry, can't lay hold of hope. What do? I was fascinated by a study recently in the Rush University Medical Center in Chicago that found, quote, that belief in a concerned God can improve response to medical treatment in patients diagnosed with clinical depression. The operative word was caring. They found that those with strong beliefs in a personal and concerned God were more likely to experience improvement. The researchers compared the levels of melancholy or hopelessness in 136 adults diagnosed with major depression or bipolar depression with their sense of religious well-being, and they found that the participants scored in the top third of the scale, charting a sense of religious well-being, and they were 75% more likely to get better with medical treatment in their clinical depression. The director of the program said, in our study, the positive response to medication, listen to this, if you won't take it from a preacher, take it from the health professional. Listen to this. Listen to this. She said, in our study, the positive response to medication had little to do with the feelings of hope that typically accompanies spiritual belief. It was tied specifically to the belief that the Supreme Being really cares about me. You think you got up this morning and came to church and it was, Sunday, we got to get there. Got to go through this one more time and get to lunch. Let's get this over with. You don't know what you did today. What you're doing right now is for your mental health and even your physical health. Church, let me say it. Thank God for science. Thank God for doctors. Thank God for medicine. Thank God for everything they have that facilitates the healing process. But I want to say to you again this morning that the medical world cannot heal you. They can set up the environment, but God alone brings the healing after they've done what they can do. And wise is the doctor who understands that. And understands. That's why they don't show up after your surgery for several hours or days, because there's nothing else they can do. They've done it. And God has to do the healing. And that's where the church comes in. And that's where this study comes in our lives. It makes a difference physically, emotionally, what we do. And it's not just religion that did it. It's specific relationship and intimacy that, my God, the Lord is my help. And without Him, I won't make it. It is that intimacy. So would you say this with me? Verses 1 and 2 again. I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Let me ask you this question. What's your focus been on? What mountain have you been looking to? Where does you think your help comes from? And you've discovered it. It's pretty, but it ain't going to help me. Oh, I like going to church, but just going to church ain't going to help me. My help comes from the Lord. Paul wrote to the Philippians, the Lord is near. Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And what happened? The peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard. And that Greek word literally means build a fort or get a junkyard dog to protect you. It will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Let me ask you in your notes though this morning, I'm afraid of, what are you afraid of this morning? What's just scaring you half to death? Would you hear His word this morning? Let's say it together. Verse 3, He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. And the next one, what's the worst thing that can happen to me? I'll write that out. You're worried about a lot of stuff. Well, what's the worst thing that can happen to you out of that? The worst situation's going on in your life right now. What's the worst thing that happened to you? Would you say this with me in answer to that? The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. Paul wrote to the Romans, if God is for us, who can be against us? Who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for all of us? How will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? It's not a promise that freedom from all trouble, but God keeps us from evil that will destroy our souls. He watches over our life. And the last thing there, I feel. What are you feeling this morning? If you've struggled with depression, maybe you don't even know how to describe how you feel. Maybe the best thing that could come is that you feel trapped. You feel distant, exiled, isolated, on an island. Nobody cares. Nobody understands. What are you feeling this morning? You'll never make it back. You'll never return. It'll never get better. Would you recite verse 8 with me against that this morning? The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. That's great self-talk, folks. I read recently of testimony of a girl kidnapped by Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. She said, here's what she said. She said, I felt that God had forsaken me. There were times when I was so angry with Him, and still I could not renounce Him. I found myself remembering His promise to never leave me or forsake me. And the reason she could get herself to that point is because she knew that the Lord would watch over her life and watch over her coming in and her going out. John the Revelator summed this all up hundreds of years later with a hope that we can live into. He saw God's people, verse 15, who have come out of great depression, great tribulation, who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. They are before the throne of God, serve Him day and night in the temple, and they sit on the thrones, will shelter them with His presence. Never again will they hunger. Never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and He will lead them by the springs of living water. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Now the whole thing. Psalm 121. Let's say it again one more time together. You ready? Here it is on the screen. I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. And I discovered in the dark night of the soul years ago that God is faithful. And when there was no help, not even a doctor or medication, God, in a miracle of His grace, brought me out, or I wouldn't be here this morning. Aren't you glad that He's good? He is our help. He is our shade. He is our guide. He is your way out. He will bring you through.